there.
So when you look at the Portola Valley and Alpine Railroad today, one thing that stands out is the fact that the good news is the bad news is the good news. The good news is it's very, very interesting because it has a lot of different changes in elevation, a lot of tight curves, gullies to cross, and what have you, which is the bad news because it means if you want to add some track, it's very difficult. You can't just not like go out in the desert and lay out another track. But that's also the good news because if you solve the problem, it means you're going to be digging tunnels and building bridges and what have you. So that's a lot of its intrigue. The point is, though, that it really represents what would be more characteristic of a narrow gauge railroad, like, for instance, the D&R GW, where they had 23, 24 degree curves and 4% grades, very common, etc. A standard gauge 4 foot 8.5 inch railroad would have never considered, couldn't have negotiated this type of terrain. So this has really turned into a narrow gauge railroad. The Bumble Bee that we're going to use today was D&R GW's, one of their original narrow gauge engines, C16. D&R GW formed a few years earlier, bought 10 engines of this size in 1882. And over the years, eventually they were replaced by the larger and larger engines. They wore out and what have you. This particular one is kind of interesting because in 1949 there was a big meet of all of the railroads in the U.S. Held in Chicago. It was called Rail Fair, and the railroads came and represented their prowess to the audience and public at large, and the D&R GW wanted to be represented there. D&R GW, again at the time, was a narrow gauge railroad exclusively, and they decided they were going to come out with a new color scheme and they were going to use Rail Fair to introduce it. And to do that, they were going to they didn't have their original engine. The first engine they had was called Montezuma, but they took what this particular engine, which became the Bumble Bee, as a consequence of this, and they modified it to look somewhat more similar to what it would have looked like in 1880, his original engine. They painted the name Montezuma on the side of it, and they put a great big long pilot, big long cow catcher out front. They put a big kerosene lamp on the top. They put a great big diamond smokestack for burning wood, and they basically said, this is our statement about D&R GW, and they came up with this new gold color scheme, aspen gold or Grande gold as it was referred to. And they painted this engine in that color scheme, loaded the engine and tender on a flat car and sent it back on a standard gauge railroad to Chicago, and it was back in Chicago for the duration of that rail fair. It ran around the picnic grounds, if you will, coincidentally Walt Disney went to that show, and I don't know whether he rode on this engine or not, but the point is he was at that. He was just becoming Ward Kimball and the other people, the animators that were in the hobby and getting him into it, took him to that rail fair, and it was a pronounced event in his life in 1949, and ultimately the Disneyland theme started with the idea of American locomotive, which he thought was the most gorgeous engine ever done. So this is that engine. So a little about the history of that. So the engine was built in 1882, and it would have been retired except that north of Gunnison, going up toward Crested Butte, in that area, was a remaining track that went up there to a coal mine, I think, at Baldwin, which is a town which I think is no longer there. In fact, there's no track or anything there. And the D&R GW had not taken out that track. We're still having to service that. And they were servicing it with their remaining engine, which was 278. And 268 was retired because it was put into this rail fair, and when it returned from rail fair, it was donated to the city of Denver, and they put it in a park. 278 was the only remaining engine that was small enough and light enough to service the Baldwin branch. 278 needed some repairs, had to go in the shop for extended repairs. So D&R GW reached out and pulled the Bumble Bee back out of the park, put it back in service. So it went into service 1950-51 time in this color scheme, and so it looked like this in service to its end of life. And then 278 was repaired. 268 and 278 shared the duties on the Baldwin branch. Eventually 278 was retired, and 268 was the last C16 narrow gauge locomotive for the DNR-GW, and it was actually used to pull up a lot of that track and the ties and what have you. And I've got a photograph which claims to be the last blowdown from that engine. Subsequently, the engine was donated to the city of Gunnison. This Baldwin branch went from Gunnison, and it's fun because if you go to Gunnison and you talk to some of the old timers there, the women that run the Pioneer Museum, which is where the engine now exists, they fondly remember that engine, and their families worked for that railroad and worked on that engine and what have you. And I went back and spoke to them and gave them a book that shows pictures of this model, and they couldn't have been nicer about it. In fact, I told my family that they should give this engine to that museum, which now has the original 268. When the 268 went in, before it went in the museum, it did get taken out to be used in a film about the DNR-GW. It's sort of based on some of the fights between them and the Santa Fe Railroad and what have you. There was this film made, and in the film, the 268 is actually destroyed, and they have a collision where they run two trains into each other. And fortunately, they had a stunt double for the Bumble Bee, and it's not the engine that was destroyed. It was in fact in the film, but they preserved it, and then it was donated to the city of Gunnison afterwards, and it's called the Gunnison Train. And it sat there, but it had been painted in black colors again, and they lost the smokestack when they replaced it with the diamond one when it went to rail fair. And but it sat outside at the Pioneer Museum in Gunnison for years and years and years outside, and was suffering from the weather and what have you. And eventually some people decided they understood the significance of this particular engine. By the way, 278 still exist as well. There are 3 of these C16s remaining, and when we made this engine, we also made 278. And then we had a friend come along and we helped him make 223, which is the 3rd one. So we have all 3 of the remaining engines operating. And as I started to say, they raised some money and they repainted the Bumble Bee in its Bumble Bee colors, and they built a nice lean-to over it, a shed to protect it from the weather. And it's now in Gunnison, sitting outside, but you can see it through the fence, or you can visit in the museum. And the engine is there to enjoy in this color scheme. And